He thought his past was buried with the war, until a broken radio deep in the Montana mountains began to send a signal no one should have heard. With his loyal German shepherd by his side, the retired soldier followed the sound and uncovered something hidden for 30 years, a truth so powerful, someone was willing to kill to keep it buried. In that frozen silence, he realized the real battle wasn't against men, but against fear, guilt, and the weight of secrets. And maybe, just maybe, God had sent him there for a reason. If you believe miracles still happen, stay with us till the end. Hit subscribe, leave your thoughts in the comments, and share this story to remind someone that God's light always finds a way. The first light of dawn stretched across the rugged Montana mountains, spilling pale gold over the valley below. The air was sharp, biting cold, filled with the scent of pine and the faint hum of distant wind turbines. The town of White Hollow lay miles away, just a small cluster of roofs, gas stations, and a church steeple swallowed by fog. Out here, silence ruled. The kind of silence that reminded Thomas Reed why he had chosen to live far from people. Thomas, 58, was a man carved by both war and solitude. His frame was solid but lean, a body kept in shape by years of military discipline and daily hikes through the woods. His short-cropped hair, once brown, was now silver along the temples. A faint scar traced from the left side of his jaw down to his neck, souvenir of an explosion in Kandahar 20 years earlier. His face was the kind that rarely smiled, but often softened when he looked at his companion. There was a weariness in his deep-set gray eyes, the kind only soldiers carried, eyes that had seen both the best and worst of humanity. Ranger, his 10-year-old German shepherd, trotted alongside him. The dog's sable coat shimmered in the morning mist, and his gait was steady, purposeful. Time had etched a few white streaks around his muzzle, but his amber eyes were bright and alert. Ranger was not just a pet. He was Thomas's shadow, his guardian, his last link to the world that had once made sense. They had met when Ranger was a military working dog in Afghanistan. The animal had saved Thomas's life by detecting a hidden IED before it detonated. Since then, the two had been inseparable. When the Army retired Ranger, Thomas adopted him without hesitation. This morning felt colder than usual. Frost kissed the tall grass, and mist curled through the pines like ghostly ribbons. Thomas adjusted his backpack, feeling the familiar weight of his old shortwave radio resting inside. The radio was dented, scratched, its once black casing faded to gray. He'd carried it during his final tour overseas, a relic of another life. Now, he used it to pick up weather updates and occasionally catch stray ham broadcasts from neighboring states. "Let's go, boy," Thomas murmured, his voice low, gravelly. Ranger perked his ears and trotted ahead, his paws crunching against frozen soil. They followed the trail behind the cabin that wound through the ridge. The forest was still waking up. The crows had not yet begun their morning argument, and even the squirrels were slow to stir. The rhythmic creak of leather and the soft jingle of Ranger's metal tag were the only sounds. Halfway through the hike, Thomas paused near an old oak tree where he usually stopped to rest. The valley below was painted with fog, the outlines of distant barns just faint smudges in the whiteness. He reached into his bag, took out the radio, and switched it on. Static filled the air, crackling like frying oil. He twisted the dial, scanning, frequencies out of habit more than curiosity. "Nothing but ghosts," he muttered with a dry smile. Then, unexpectedly, something cut through the static, a faint, rhythmic beeping. Beep, beep. Pause, beep, beep, beep. Thomas frowned. He turned the knob slowly, adjusting the frequency. The pattern repeated, clearer this time. It was Morse code, no doubt about it. His soldier instincts flickered to life, muscle memory from years of listening to coded communications. "Ranger, you hearing this?" he said under his breath. The dog lifted his head, ears twitching. Then he turned toward the north ridge, tail stiff, growling softly. Thomas followed his gaze. Beyond the trees, the mountain slope rose into mist, veiled and distant. He hesitated. Morse signals were rare these days, especially this deep in the wilderness. Maybe it was some hobbyist playing around with old equipment, or maybe, just maybe, something else. He scribbled the signal down in his small leather notebook. 3 short, 3 long, 3 short, SOS. His heart skipped. The message was weak, fading in and out, but it wasn't random. Someone, or something, was transmitting it deliberately. The cold bit deeper as a gust of wind swept through the pines. Thomas pulled up his jacket collar and listened again. The radio hissed, then fell silent. No more beeping. Only the low hum of static remained. For a long moment, Thomas stood motionless, staring toward the ridge. The morning sun was starting to burn through the fog, revealing the distant outline of Mount Hollow. He had patrolled that area years ago when the Forest Service had asked for volunteer veterans to help monitor illegal hunting. It was remote, inaccessible, and treacherous. Few people went there now. Ranger barked once, short and sharp. His fur bristled, nose pointed toward the same direction as before. All right, Thomas said, exhaling a frosty breath. "You win." He turned off the radio, slid it back into his pack, and tightened the straps. For the first time in years, something stirred inside him. Curiosity, purpose, and a faint pulse of unease. They resumed walking, but this time Thomas didn't follow the familiar loop that led back to the cabin. Instead, he turned north, toward the slope where the mist thickened into silver sheets. Ranger trotted a few paces ahead, tail swaying like a pendulum, every sense alert. The climb grew steeper. Rocks jutted from the soil like broken bones, and the air grew thinner. Thomas's breath came in slow, heavy clouds. His shoulder ached where an old injury still flared up in cold weather, but he ignored it. Ranger stopped occasionally, sniffing the ground, growling softly at unseen things hidden in the fog. At the top of the rise, they reached a narrow clearing. From here, Thomas could see the faint outline of an old ranger tower miles away, a relic from another era. The signal, he realized, had been coming from that direction. He crouched, resting one knee on the cold ground, and pulled the radio out once more. The device sputtered, crackled, then went dead. He hit the side gently, coaxing it back to life. For a heartbeat, silence, then beep, beep. Pause, beep, beep, beep. It was back, faint, insistent, like a voice refusing to die. Ranger let out a low growl, nose pressing into Thomas's leg. His amber eyes were fixed on the far horizon. Thomas looked down at the dog and smiled faintly. "You feel it too, don't you?" The beeping faded again, swallowed by static. Thomas straightened up, his mind racing. Logic told him to go home, make coffee, and forget this nonsense. But his gut, his soldier's instinct, told him the opposite. Whatever was out there wasn't random. It was a call, and calls like that, they weren't meant to be ignored. He tightened his jacket, adjusted the straps on his pack, and took a deep breath of the cold mountain air. The mist swirled around him like a veil, and for the first time in years, he felt alive. "Come on, Ranger," he said, his voice firm. "Let's find out who's talking." The German shepherd barked once, sharp and eager, before bounding ahead down the foggy trail. Thomas followed, the sound of their footsteps fading into the whispering forest as the radio hummed faintly inside his pack, its signal pulsing like a heartbeat from the past. The fog never truly lifted in the upper reaches of the Montana Range. By noon, the mist had thinned enough for Thomas Reed to see the faint outlines of jagged cliffs rising ahead, their surfaces streaked with veins of quartz that glimmered under the weak sunlight. The air was colder now, dense with the smell of wet rock and pine resin. Ranger padded ahead, his ears alert, tail low but steady, his paws leaving clean impressions on the damp soil. The old soldier followed, his breath visible in short bursts, his radio slung tight to his shoulder. They had been hiking for hours since hearing the signal. The narrow trail wound upward like a scar across the hillside. The forest grew denser here, shadows pooling between the trunks of spruce and fir. Every so often, Thomas stopped to check the radio. The faint Morse beeps returned intermittently, stronger each time, as though the mountain itself was calling him. He couldn't shake the memory of that name. D. Cole. David Cole had been more than a friend. He had been Thomas's sergeant, a man of broad shoulders, a hawkish nose, and a voice that could command attention in a storm. Cole had always been fearless. Too fearless, perhaps. He had a dry humor that could cut through the thickest tension. But something in him had changed after the mission in 1994, when their unit was sent deep into a classified zone in these very mountains. They were told to monitor a testing site, but when the explosion started, when the ground trembled and the air stank of chemicals, the truth became clear. They were witnessing something the military never wanted public. Cole never made it back. The official report said he was missing in action. Thomas had always believed there was more to it. "Still looking out for me, huh, Dave?" Thomas murmured as he stopped by a fallen log. He took out the radio, twisting the dial again. The sound sharpened. Beep, beep, pause, beep, beep, beep. Ranger growled softly, head turning toward the north ridge. Thomas followed the dog's gaze and spotted what looked like a faint trail veering off the main path, half swallowed by underbrush. "Good eyes, partner," he said, patting Ranger's flank. The German shepherd wagged his tail once before pushing ahead, nosing through the foliage. The detour led them toward a ravine where boulders jutted like ancient sentinels. The sound of dripping water echoed faintly, rhythmic and hollow. Thomas crouched, brushing moss from one of the stones. The pattern beneath was unnatural. Tool marks, straight cuts where no erosion could reach. Someone had been here recently. Before he could investigate further, a sound cracked through the silence, the sharp snap of a twig. Ranger's body stiffened instantly. Thomas turned, hand instinctively moving to the hunting knife at his belt. From the fog emerged a silhouette. A woman, mid-30s, holding a camera and wearing a forest green parka. Her blonde hair was tied back, and her cheeks were flushed red from the cold. She froze when she saw him. "Whoa," she said quickly, raising one hand. "Sorry. Didn't mean to scare you." Thomas narrowed his eyes but relaxed slightly. "You're not supposed to be out here. This trail's restricted." "I know," the woman replied, stepping closer, careful not to startle Ranger. "I'm Sarah Mitchell, wildlife photographer. I work for Montana Echo magazine. I was following a lead about an abandoned radio station somewhere in these mountains. You must have heard the signal too." Sarah's voice carried confidence but also curiosity, the kind that got people into trouble. Her green eyes gleamed with determination, though there was a trace of exhaustion beneath them. She was tall, slender, with the wiry build of someone used to long hikes and sleepless nights editing photos. Her camera strap bore scratches and duct tape repairs, evidence of years spent chasing storms and wild animals across the frontier. Thomas studied her silently. He'd seen her type before, civilians drawn to danger for the story, not realizing what kind of truths they might uncover. "You shouldn't be here alone," he said. "This area's unstable. Old tunnels, sinkholes. Government shut it down decades ago." Sarah gave a faint smile. "Good thing I'm not alone anymore." Thomas shook his head, but before he could respond, the radio crackled again, louder this time, the beeping rapid and erratic. He adjusted the tuner, and the signal stabilized. SOS D. Cole. Then, silence. Sarah blinked. "Did that say?" "Yeah," Thomas interrupted quietly. "It did." The two exchanged a look, a silent understanding that neither could walk away now. Ranger whined softly, circling near the rock wall. His paws scratched at the ground near a crevice, and when Thomas knelt to check, he felt a faint draft of cold air flowing through. The sound of the radio signal seemed to pulse from within the stone itself. "There's a passage here," Thomas said, running his fingers along the crack. "It's been sealed for a long time." Sarah crouched beside him, brushing her hair from her face. "You think your friend could still be—" Thomas shook his head. 30 years is a long time, but someone, or something, is using his name." They worked together clearing loose stones, widening the gap enough for light to pass through. A faint metallic glint reflected from the darkness inside. Wires, maybe, or equipment. Ranger barked once, his tail stiff, muscles tense. Thomas pressed a hand to the dog's neck. "Easy, boy." Then to Sarah, "We'll come back tomorrow with lights and ropes. It's not safe to go in now." The wind shifted suddenly, carrying the faint echo of another sound. Not Morse this time, but a human voice, distant and distorted, like a recording trapped in static. 3 words came through before fading again. "Don't trust anyone." Sarah looked at him, alarm flashing across her face. Thomas's jaw tightened. He switched off the radio and slipped it into his pack. "We leave before dark," he said. "Tomorrow we find out what's really buried in these mountains." As they started back down the trail, the fog thickened once more, curling between the stones like smoke. Behind them, the beeping resumed, steady and deliberate, as if someone was waiting. The next morning broke under a gray, reluctant light. Clouds hung low over the mountains, heavy with the promise of rain. The forest was still damp from the night before, and the air smelled of earth and pine. Thomas Reed tightened the straps on his pack and glanced toward Sarah Mitchell, who was kneeling beside her tripod, adjusting the lens of her camera. She had slept poorly, her eyes shadowed, lips pressed thin, but she refused to show fatigue. Ranger stood nearby, tail low, his fur bristling slightly, as if the mountain air itself carried warnings. "Ready?" Thomas asked. Sarah nodded, slipping the camera into her bag. "Let's find out what your friend wanted us to see." They made their way back toward the ridge, the same path now cloaked in thicker fog. The world felt quieter than before, the kind of silence that made every sound, the crunch of gravel, the faint rustle of leaves, feel amplified. As they approached the ravine, Thomas noticed fresh disturbances in the soil, bootprints, larger than his. He crouched, fingers tracing the damp outline. "Someone's been here," he murmured. Sarah leaned over his shoulder. "Could be rangers?" Thomas shook his head. "No one's patrolled this area in years." His voice dropped, instinctive and tight. Keep your eyes open. The trail led them back to the crevice they had found yesterday. Ranger sniffed the air, then began pawing at the moss-covered stones. The dog's hackles rose. "Good boy," Thomas whispered, helping him clear debris. As the opening widened, a draft of cold, metallic air flowed out, sharp with the scent of rust and something older, like burnt oil. Thomas flicked on his flashlight and ducked inside. The cave's mouth sloped down into darkness, walls slick with condensation and veins of green moss. Every step echoed, and the beam of light trembled across jagged rock. Sarah followed closely behind, holding a smaller light in one hand and the camera in the other. Her breath was shallow. "It smells like gunpowder," she said softly. "Yeah," Thomas replied, "and old metal." Ranger led the way deeper into the cave until the tunnel widened into a small chamber. In the middle of the space sat a rusted table and an old military-style generator, half buried under dust. Cables snaked across the floor toward a metal box propped against the wall. A radio transmitter, outdated but still humming faintly. Thomas's pulse quickened. He knelt beside it, brushing off grime to reveal a faded tag. "Property of U.S. Army, 1994. The radio emitted an irregular crackle. The frequency meter twitched weakly. He pressed one of the dials, and a burst of static filled the air, followed by a broken pattern of Morse beeps, weak but familiar. Sarah crouched beside him, her light catching on something charred lying nearby. "Thomas, look at this." It was a notebook, its edges blackened as if scorched by fire. The cover had nearly disintegrated, but faint writing still clung to the inside pages. The ink had bled into the paper, yet one name was unmistakable: D. Cole, 1994. Thomas froze. His throat tightened as he flipped through the damaged pages. He could make out coordinates, shorthand mission notes, and a final line. Half burned but still legible. "If found, tell the truth." His mind raced. Cole had been here. Maybe not alive now, but close enough to leave a trail. "Damn it, Dave," Thomas whispered, voice trembling between grief and awe. "You were right all along." Sarah leaned in, scanning the page. "These coordinates," she pointed to a section of the notebook, "they lead further east, toward the restricted valley." Thomas nodded grimly. "The testing site." Before he could say more, Ranger began growling low in his throat. The dog's eyes fixed on the cave entrance. Thomas turned off his flashlight, listening. For a long moment, there was nothing but the hum of the radio and their own breathing. Then, a faint crunch of footsteps outside. Sarah's hand tightened around her light. "Someone followed us." Thomas motioned for silence. He drew the small revolver from his belt, a habit he'd never fully abandoned. The steps stopped, replaced by the distant drip of water. Ranger growled again, louder this time. After several tense seconds, the noise faded. Whoever or whatever it was, they were gone. Thomas exhaled slowly, lowering his weapon. "We need to leave," he said. "Now." Sarah hesitated, glancing back at the radio. "Shouldn't we take something? Proof?" Thomas reached for the burned notebook and slipped it into his pack. "This is proof enough." They started back toward the entrance. As they stepped out into the gray daylight, the air felt heavier, oppressive. The fog had thickened to the point that visibility dropped to mere feet. But just outside the cave mouth, Thomas stopped short. In the mud, clearly outlined beside their own footprints, was a single set of fresh boot prints, larger, deeper, pointing toward the cave. He crouched, touching the edge. The soil was still wet but warm from pressure. They were here not 10 minutes ago. Sarah looked around nervously. Who? Thomas didn't answer. His jaw clenched as he scanned the trees, eyes narrowing against the mist. Someone who doesn't want us finding out what happened here. Ranger barked once, sharp and alert. Somewhere far off, an echo answered. Perhaps a rock fall, or something else entirely. The mountains seemed to breathe around them, as though alive with secrets. Thomas tightened his grip on the pack and motioned for Sarah to move. We head down before dark. We'll regroup and come back ready. As they descended the trail, neither spoke. Behind them, inside the silent cave, the old radio flickered once more, its dying battery crackling to life, sending out one last, broken message into the cold air. Not alone. The following morning dawned grim and windless, as though the entire mountain was holding its breath. The fog had lifted, replaced by a low, heavy sky that pressed down on the trees. Thomas Reed moved quietly, his pack slung over one shoulder, his boots crunching against the frosted ground. Sarah Mitchell followed close behind, her camera replaced this time by a flashlight and a small crowbar. Ranger padded ahead, muscles tense, tail stiff with unease. The three of them had set out before sunrise, guided by the coordinates scrawled in David Cole's charred notebook. East Ridge, Lower Basin, Thomas murmured, reading from the torn page. Coordinates lead somewhere past the old fire break. Sarah glanced up, her breath fogging the air. You think we'll find another cave? Thomas shook his head. Not a cave, a facility. Cole wrote about a storage site, not a shelter. They hiked for an hour through thick brush and uneven ground, until the trees began to thin and the slope descended into a hollow. The air grew colder, and a faint metallic tang clung to the breeze. Ranger stopped suddenly, ears erect, nose pressed to the ground. He barked once and began digging near a moss-covered mound of stones. Thomas joined him, clearing away debris with his gloved hands. Beneath the soil was a flat metal surface, a hatch, its edges welded but corroded with age. Sarah crouched beside him, brushing off the dirt. Jesus, this thing's been here for decades. Help me with that lever, Thomas said. Together they pried the hatch open. The hinges groaned like an old animal. A rush of stale chemical air escaped from below. Ranger whined softly, stepping back, his fur bristling. A rusted ladder led down into darkness. Thomas went first, flashlight in his teeth, gripping the cold metal rungs as he descended. The air grew thick with the smell of mildew and something acrid, chemical residue that burned the throat. Sarah followed, her camera light flickering against the concrete walls. Ranger hesitated before finally leaping down, landing lightly beside Thomas with a low growl. The tunnel stretched ahead, narrow and lined with faded hazard symbols, biohazard warnings, radiation signs, the kind of markings Thomas hadn't seen since his days in Afghanistan. They walked in silence until the tunnel opened into a cavernous chamber filled with old filing cabinets, metal crates, and rows of computers encased in thick dust. Sarah exhaled in disbelief. This is a government archive. Thomas swept his light across the room. Not just that, he said. This was a test site command post. He walked to a rusted desk and picked up a folder half buried in dust. Inside were yellowed reports, stamped classified, diagrams of the Montana forest grid, chemical formulas, test results labeled Operation Winter Fog. Sarah's voice trembled. This says they were testing dispersal gas compounds here, and civilian exposure zones. Thomas's jaw tightened. They were experimenting on the land, maybe even people. He flipped another page, revealing a faded photograph of uniformed men standing beside metal drums. One of the signatures at the bottom read Capt. D. Cole. His chest constricted. Dave was here, he whispered. He tried to stop them. Before Sarah could respond, Ranger growled again, deep, warning. The sound echoed off the concrete. Thomas turned off his flashlight and motioned for silence. Footsteps, heavy, deliberate, coming from the entrance tunnel. Then a beam of light cut through the dark. A man emerged from the shadows, mid-40s, tall and broad-shouldered, wearing a ranger's jacket with no name patch. His face was weathered, the kind that had seen too many winters. A jagged scar ran across his right cheek, and his eyes, cold blue, unreadable, glinted beneath the flashlight. He held a pistol loosely at his side. "Well," the man said, voice calm but edged with iron. "I was wondering when someone would come looking." Thomas straightened, his stance instinctively defensive. "Who are you?" The man smiled faintly. "Call me Blake. I keep this place quiet. That's my job." His voice carried authority, the kind born from command, not bluff. There was something military about his posture, the way his fingers hovered near the trigger, relaxed but ready. Sarah stepped forward cautiously. "If you're with the government, then you know what's in these files. You know what they did here." Blake's expression hardened. "What they did here kept this country safe. Some truths aren't meant for daylight." Thomas clenched his fists. "That's the same line they fed us 30 years ago. My friend tried to tell the truth, and you buried him for it." For a brief moment, Blake's eyes flickered with something almost human. Regret, maybe. Then it was gone. "David Cole made a choice. You're about to make yours." The sound of the pistol's hammer cocking echoed in the chamber. Ranger barked fiercely, stepping in front of Thomas, teeth bared. The tension snapped like a live wire. Thomas lunged, knocking Blake's arm aside. The gun fired, the bullet sparking against the steel wall. Sarah ducked, shouting. Ranger leapt, slamming into Blake's chest. They crashed into a desk, papers scattering. Thomas grabbed the pistol as it slid across the floor. His shoulder throbbed, his breath ragged. Blake tried to rise, but Ranger pinned him down, growling. "Call off the dog," Blake hissed. "Not until you tell me what happened to Cole," Thomas said, aiming the gun. Blake's jaw worked, blood running from a cut on his lip. "Cole tried to leak the data. He used the transmitter in the cave. We stopped the signal, but he didn't stop fighting. The cave collapsed before we could clean up." Sarah's voice was low, furious. "You killed him." "No," Blake said coldly. "He killed himself trying to expose something bigger than he understood." For a moment, silence hung heavy in the room. Then the ceiling above them groaned. Dust rained down. The years of corrosion had weakened the structure. Thomas looked up, realization flashing across his face. "It's collapsing! Move!" He yanked Sarah toward the ladder as Ranger bounded ahead. Behind them, Blake staggered to his feet, shouting something lost in the roar of falling debris. The tunnel shook violently as they climbed out into the open air, the hatch slamming shut under the tremor. Thomas fell to his knees on the frozen ground, gasping. The earth below rumbled once, then fell silent. The entrance was gone, buried beneath a layer of rock and soil. Ranger pressed close to his side, panting heavily. Sarah stood over them, dirt streaked across her face, eyes wide with shock. Thomas looked back at the mound of earth. "He was right," he whispered. "Cole was right all along. The night after the collapse was a blur of wind, pain, and silence. The storm that had been gathering for days finally broke over the mountains, drenching the forest in icy rain. Thomas Reed sat with his back against a fallen tree, pressing a makeshift bandage to his shoulder. The bleeding had slowed, but every heartbeat still sent a dull throb through the muscle. Ranger lay beside him, his fur matted with dirt and streaks of mud, chest rising and falling heavily. Sarah Mitchell crouched nearby, clutching the emergency blanket around her trembling frame. Her blonde hair clung to her face, soaked and tangled, and her lips were pale with exhaustion. "Let me look at it," she said, reaching for Thomas's arm. Her hands were cold but steady. "It's fine," he muttered, though his voice was strained. Sarah tore a strip of her flannel sleeve, tightening it over the wound. "That's not fine," she said, her tone sharp but laced with worry. "You need help." He gave a faint grin despite the pain. "You're starting to sound like someone who cares." "Maybe I do," she replied softly, looking away. The rain eased into a steady drizzle, and the sky above the pines flickered with distant lightning. Somewhere in the distance, a rock slide rumbled, the final collapse of the underground facility they'd escaped from. The sound made Thomas's stomach twist. Somewhere down there, beneath tons of earth, Blake was gone, and so were the last physical traces of David Cole's mission. But not the truth. Not entirely. Thomas reached for his old radio, the same dented device that had started everything. Its casing was cracked, but the signal light still flickered weakly. He brushed mud from the knobs and adjusted the frequency. The static cleared for a second, then hissed again. "What are you doing?" Sarah asked. "Sending a message," he said. "The only thing left to do." He tapped the transmitter key slowly, the rhythm deliberate. TTR. Truth to reveal. The sound echoed faintly through the forest, a lonely heartbeat pulsing against the rain. Sarah watched him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. She finally spoke, voice quiet. "When they find us, what then? You think anyone will believe what happened?" Thomas looked toward the horizon where the storm clouds were beginning to break, revealing faint streaks of dawn. "Maybe they won't," he said. "But the truth doesn't need belief to exist. It just needs to be heard." Ranger stirred, lifting his head. His amber eyes reflected the weak light, calm and loyal as ever. Thomas stroked his fur gently. "Good boy," he whispered. "You saved us again." Sarah smiled faintly. "He's a hero. You both are." Thomas chuckled softly. "He's the better half of the team." For a while, none of them spoke. The wind carried the scent of wet pine and ash. The forest seemed almost peaceful now, as if it, too, was relieved that the buried secrets had been silenced. But Thomas couldn't shake the feeling that someone, somewhere, would still be listening. The radio continued to hum faintly, its antenna glinting with raindrops. Hours passed. The storm gave way to a pale, washed-out sky. Thomas's vision blurred with fatigue. He didn't notice the distant thump of rotors until Sarah touched his arm. "Listen," she said. He opened his eyes. The sound grew louder, rhythmic, mechanical. A helicopter was cutting through the clouds above the ridge, its searchlight sweeping the forest floor. Sarah jumped to her feet, waving her jacket. "Over here!" she shouted, voice cracking with relief. Thomas managed a weak smile as he leaned back against the tree. Ranger barked once, tail thumping the ground. Moments later, rescuers descended. 2 paramedics in orange jackets and a forest ranger in a green uniform. The ranger, a tall man in his early 40s named Mark Jensen, moved quickly toward Thomas. Mark had the look of a man used to hard work and harder decisions, a square jaw shadowed by a short beard, kind eyes that contrasted with his military straight posture. "What happened here?" Mark asked, scanning the wreckage and debris around them. "Long story," Thomas rasped. "But it's over." Mark nodded, signaling the medics. "Let's get you out." They lifted Thomas onto a stretcher, Ranger refusing to leave his side until Mark personally helped lift the dog aboard the chopper. Sarah climbed in last, gripping the door frame as the helicopter lifted off. The ground below disappeared into mist and pine tops. As they ascended, Thomas looked out the window. The first rays of sunlight were breaking over the Montana peaks, washing the world in gold. The forest below looked calm, almost innocent, betraying no trace of the secrets buried within it. Sarah sat beside him, silent, her eyes reflecting both awe and sorrow. Ranger's head rested on Thomas's lap, eyes closing slowly as if he too finally allowed himself to rest. Thomas turned the cracked radio in his hand, thumb brushing the dial. The static whispered softly. Then faintly, the Morse signal played one last time. TTR, the same rhythm he had sent hours earlier. He smiled faintly. "Guess someone heard us after all." The sunlight spilled across his face, warm and forgiving. The helicopter veered north toward the valley, leaving behind the mountain that had swallowed so many truths. As they disappeared into the bright horizon, the wind carried the last faint echoes of the transmission, fading but never forgotten. Sometimes, life's deepest truths are buried, not under mountains or earth, but under years of silence, fear, and regret. Thomas's journey wasn't just about uncovering a secret. It was about finding light in darkness and faith in moments when all seemed lost. When he sent that last signal, truth to reveal, it wasn't only a message to the world, but a prayer whispered into the wind. It reminds us that God's hand often works quietly, through courage, love, and even the loyalty of a faithful friend like Ranger. Sometimes the miracle isn't in the thunder or the fire. It's in the small moments when truth wins over fear, when hope rises again like the Montana sunrise. So if this story touched your heart, take a moment to share it. Leave a comment about what truth means to you and how you've seen God's miracles in your own life. Subscribe to the channel to keep spreading stories of hope, faith, and redemption. And may the Lord bless and protect every one of you who believes that even in the darkest night, His light still finds a way through.